Hey, it's Lyla. In this video, we're going to reforge this Stormcast Eternal into something Sigmar would be proud of. If it isn't clear, I obviously, joking aside, don't know very much about Warhammer. But purchasing a sad Warhammer model from the depths of eBay and doing my own eBay miniature rescue always seemed like a fun idea. Before we begin, a quick shout out to eBay Miniature Rescues. He is obviously the OG. Go ahead and check it out here as well as the description of this video. I set my sights on eBay and looked for the cheapest and worst model that I could find in the Buy Now section. I settled on the Stormcast model from Age of Sigmar for $13. She's done to a pretty decent level and is actually far better than what I expected to find, but this was the worst I found. After purchasing this model, Dave from Table Ready Gaming gave me a quick rundown of the lore of Warhammer. In discussing the history of Age of Sigmar, he brought up the idea of Sigmar reforging Stormcast knights and making them into better soldiers. So, although I know almost nothing, why not take on the role of Sigmar and reforge this Age of Sigmar Stormcast Eternal miniature and make it into a better version of itself. So my plan is to recreate this model, just better. I began by placing the model in a bowl of simple green, and being as impatient as I am, began to scrub at it with a toothbrush and other instruments until the model was clean. I know that there are better and easier techniques, but I didn't want to go purchase anything specifically to strip this one model. With this fresh model, I double-checked all the mold lines and sanded where need be. The previous owner had filled some gaps with milliput, so I quickly sanded it all down until it was smooth. Next was zenithal highlighting. Yellow and red can be a bit finicky, so I prefer to paint over pure white when possible. So after applying my zenithal highlights through my airbrush, I went back in with white on a paintbrush and gave those areas an extra coat of white to achieve the vibrancy I wanted. My first round of red went on really poorly, but I had my husband shake up my red paint and the second coat applied beautifully. Although I'm not a very big fan of a very yellow gold, it was the intention of the original painter, so I'm going to go ahead and place a vibrant yellow on the golden parts of this armor. For the silver, I always prefer to paint my silver with a tinge of blue, so that's what I will be doing. For both of these colors, I started with a lighter mid-tone, but I don't particularly have a reason for why I started it that way. That's just how I ended up painting it. Next, I'm filling in the rest of my model to match the original color scheme. To help this model look more cohesive, I'm working with a limited color palette. For example, the blue I used to create the armor colors will be the same blue that's on the pauldrons. The yellow that was used in the gold trim will also be used on the hair. Repeating these colors across the model will help it appear more cohesive in the end. Once I'm done with the base coats, I put the model off to the side to get photographed. Since it looked like the original painter only did base coats and washes, I thought it might be a fun time to do a comparison. Now that the base coats have been applied, let's get on to painting the rest of the figure. Having photographed the model previously, I'm going to be using these photos as references for my NMM. I have to say that painting the staff was the most difficult part of this model, but the feeling of satisfaction when I was done was definitely worth it. I based the areas that would be brighter with pure white, then lined the recesses with a wine red to keep the color warm and vibrant. These same colors are then also being used to create the dark to light gradation on the pauldrons. The armor was done with stippling. Using my Winsor Newton size 0, I stippled in my highlights and shadows, then blended them together with a mid-tone color. For right now, it's okay that they're not very smooth. I'll be glazing it all in later to make it so that it looks perfectly even. Moving back to the red, it was time to add shadows. I placed a dark wine red in my shadow areas with a plan of glazing the transitions later. I will 100% admit that red is my nemesis. I just have the hardest time painting vibrant red and getting it to look smooth. I quickly took the same dark red and roughly placed shadows in the feathers of the helmet. I then decided that my red didn't have enough contrast. I mixed red and white to give the red more opacity and placed it onto my model, blending out the edges with feathering. This looks a bit intense at the moment, but it's going to turn into beautiful red highlighting later. Then I took my intense red and painted over my highlighted areas. Since I blended the pink earlier, the red smoothly blends over the light to dark paint underneath and results in a perfectly smooth shade of red. The face and I did not get along. As one of my patrons explained, she looked like she had an expression of "help me," so obviously it needed some work. I began by shading in the hollows of her cheeks with a color a few shades darker than her skin tone and blended it out with a glaze mixture created by combining my shadow color and base face color. While my brush still had paint on it, I then applied that glaze across her face everywhere except the cheekbones, which I wanted to have the brightest highlight. To recreate the blue glowing eyes, I based her eyes in royal blue. I then went back in with my base face color and sculpted the shape of the eyes. I used my main skin color to sculpt the bottom of her eyes, and I used the darker shadow color at the top of her eyes because the top of the eyes or the eyelids are normally in shadow. Lastly, I added a white dot to the eyes to act as the pupil iris. Next, I worked on stippling in the highlights of the pauldron. I focused my lighter blue on the areas that were tipped upwards and increased the saturation and darkened the blue on the more vertical facing sides. To add the blue glow to her eyes, I thinned down some blue FX Flower paint from scale 75. I tried using the scale 75 FX Flower paint elsewhere on the model to increase the vibrancy, but the FX Flower paint are so incredibly matte that there was this really clear denotation as to where I had used those paints versus where I had used paints elsewhere on the model. Perhaps I could have gone over all of it with a satin varnish to help even it all out, but I just decided to paint over it and experiment with them later. I created definition on the handle of the staff by lining each fold of fabric with black, and then painting in the areas I wanted to be an intense red with my white-pink mixture as I did before. The closer together you put your highlight and shadows, the more contrast they are appeased to be. I then went over my pink with a vibrant red and ran a darker red down the side of the staff to make it appear round. Lastly, we're adding in a few other details that I missed, as well as using inks to brighten and add more saturation to certain parts of the model. Let me know your thoughts. Would Sigmar or Squidmar be proud of this model? Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I hope that it was useful and helpful to you. If you like what I do here, the best way that you can support me is by going over to Patreon. Otherwise, buy my merchandise, or if you're interested in free ways to support me, like, subscribe, and follow me on Instagram. I love to hear from you. I hope you're doing well, and I'll see you on the next one.